The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace. Tourists gathered in clusters, cameras ready, hoping to catch a glimpse of the famous changing of the guard ceremony. Among them stood Marcus Thompson, a United States Marine on leave, wearing his dress blue uniform with pride. The medals on his chest caught the light as he moved through the crowd, drawing respectful nods from fellow visitors. Marcus had served 3 tours in Afghanistan before earning his current position at the American Embassy in London. Today was supposed to be a peaceful visit to one of Britain's most iconic landmarks. He had promised his younger sister back home that he would take photos of the royal guards she had read about in her history books. Little did he know that this ordinary morning would become anything but ordinary. The crowd grew thicker as the ceremony time approached. Marcus found himself pressed against the black iron railings, his trained eyes automatically scanning the area. Old habits from combat zones never truly disappeared. He noticed every exit, every potential threat, every unusual movement in the sea of tourists surrounding him. That's when he saw him. Across the courtyard, standing perfectly still in his red tunic and tall black bearskin hat, was Royal Guard James Wellington. At 26, James had served with distinction in the Welsh Guards for 8 years. His military record was spotless, his dedication unwavering, and his pride in wearing the Queen's uniform ran deeper than most people could understand. The 2 soldiers locked eyes across the distance. Something passed between them in that moment. An instant recognition that only warriors could share. They had never met, never spoken, but each could see the steel in the other's gaze. Marcus straightened his shoulders unconsciously, while James's already perfect posture somehow became even more rigid. The crowd around Marcus began to murmur excitedly as the ceremony commenced. Red-coated guards marched in perfect formation, their movements precise and synchronized. The sound of their boots echoed off the palace walls like thunder. Tourists raised their phones and cameras, desperate to capture every moment of the spectacle. But Marcus's attention remained fixed on James. He could see the concentration in the guard's face, the way his eyes stayed forward despite the chaos of tourists around him. There was something familiar about that look. The same expression Marcus had worn during countless honor guard duties at military ceremonies back home. As the ceremony continued, a small incident occurred that would change everything. A young child, maybe 7 years old, broke free from his mother's grip and ran toward the marching guards. The crowd gasped as security moved to intercept, but the child was fast and determined. He wanted to touch the fuzzy hat of one of the guards, completely unaware of the strict protocols he was breaking. Marcus reacted without thinking. His military training kicked in, and he smoothly intercepted the child, gently but firmly guiding him back to his worried mother. The entire interaction lasted only seconds, but it was executed with the kind of precision that only came from years of training and service. James had witnessed the entire event from his position. He saw how quickly and professionally the American Marine had handled the situation, how he had protected both the child and the integrity of the ceremony without causing a scene. A flicker of respect crossed his features, though he maintained his stoic expression. The ceremony concluded without further incident, and the guards began to disperse. But instead of moving away, James remained at his post. His duty shift wasn't over, and he would stand there for another hour, motionless and vigilant. The crowds began to thin, but Marcus found himself unable to leave. He approached the spot where James stood guard, stopping at a respectful distance. Other tourists continued to take photos and ask questions that would go unanswered, but Marcus simply stood there. He wasn't gawking or trying to get a reaction. He was showing the respect of one professional to another. Minutes passed in silence. James was acutely aware of the Marine's presence but gave no indication. This was part of his job, to remain unmoved regardless of what happened around him. He had endured rain, snow, and blazing heat while maintaining his post. He had ignored drunk tourists, crying babies, and even the occasional protester. But something about this American soldier felt different. Marcus understood the challenge without words being spoken. He recognized the discipline it took to stand perfectly still while crowds of people treated you like a tourist attraction. He had performed similar duties at Arlington National Cemetery, standing guard over the tomb of the unknown soldier. The parallels were unmistakable. Other tourists began to notice the strange standoff. Here was an American Marine standing at attention in his own uniform, facing off against a British Royal Guard. Neither moved, neither spoke, but the tension between them was palpable. Whispers began to spread through the remaining crowd. "What's happening over there? Is this part of the show? Why is that American soldier just standing there?" A small circle of onlookers began to form, sensing that something significant was taking place. Some raised their cameras, uncertain whether they were witnessing a confrontation or some sort of military tradition they didn't understand. The afternoon sun climbed higher, casting shorter shadows across the courtyard. Both men remained motionless, locked in their silent contest of wills. Sweat began to bead on Marcus's forehead, but he didn't wipe it away. His breathing remained steady and controlled, just as he had been trained. James felt the familiar ache in his legs that came from extended periods of standing, but he had endured far worse. During his training at the Infantry Training Center Catterick, he had learned to ignore physical discomfort entirely. His mind remained focused, his body perfectly still. A palace guard supervisor noticed the gathering crowd and approached to investigate. He saw the American Marine standing in what appeared to be an unofficial honor guard position, facing one of his guards. The supervisor was experienced enough to recognize military bearing when he saw it, and he made the decision not to interfere. Whatever was happening here, it was between two soldiers who clearly understood each other. As the first hour passed, the crowd around them grew larger. Word had somehow spread through the tourist groups, and people were actively seeking out the location of this unusual display. Some visitors who had planned to leave the palace grounds decided to stay and watch what was developing into the most interesting thing they had seen all day. Marcus felt the eyes of dozens of strangers on him, but he blocked out their presence. In his mind, there was only himself and the British Guard across from him. This had become something more than a casual encounter. It was a test of everything he had learned about discipline, endurance, and respect. The palace staff began to take notice as well. Guards who had finished their shifts lingered nearby, curious about their colleagues' situation. None of them had ever seen anything quite like this before. An American serviceman, clearly on his own initiative, had positioned himself in what could only be described as a reciprocal honor guard position. James's commanding officer, Captain Robert Hayes, emerged from the guard room to see what was causing the commotion. He observed the scene for several minutes before approaching one of his subordinates. "How long has this been going on?" he asked quietly. "About an hour and 20 minutes, sir," came the reply. "The American hasn't moved once. Neither has Wellington." Captain Hayes studied Marcus's uniform and bearing with a professional eye. He could see the combat ribbons, the expert marksmanship badges, the evidence of a soldier who had seen real service. This wasn't some tourist playing games. This was a genuine display of military respect. The captain made another decision that would prove crucial to what was about to unfold. He ordered his men to maintain a discreet perimeter around the two soldiers, ensuring that the growing crowd of spectators didn't interfere with whatever was taking place. As the second hour approached, neither Marcus nor James showed any signs of yielding. The silent showdown had captured the imagination of everyone present, and word was beginning to spread beyond the palace grounds through social media posts and messages to friends and family around the world. The second hour brought unexpected challenges that neither soldier had anticipated. A light drizzle began to fall across London, the kind of persistent English rain that soaked through everything slowly but surely. Tourists scrambled for umbrellas and covered areas. But Marcus and James remained exactly where they were. Water droplets collected on the brim of Marcus's white dress cap and rolled down his face. His dress blue uniform, usually pristine and sharp, began to darken with moisture. But his posture never wavered. He had stood in worse conditions during memorial services in Washington, where sudden storms had tested every guard's resolve. James felt the rain seeping through the wool of his red tunic, but his expression remained unchanged. The tall bearskin hat on his head was designed to shed water, a practical feature developed over centuries of British weather. Still, he could feel the moisture working its way down his neck and back. Neither the rain nor the growing crowd of spectators could break his concentration. Among the witnesses was Margaret Chen, an elderly British woman who had been visiting the palace with her granddaughter. Margaret had lived through the London Blitz and recognized something profound when she saw it. She whispered to her granddaughter, "That young American is showing tremendous respect. This isn't about competition, dear. It's about honor." Her words carried further than she intended, and other spectators began to understand what they were witnessing. This wasn't a confrontation or a challenge in the traditional sense. It was a demonstration of mutual respect between two professional soldiers from different nations. Dr. Ahmed Hassan, a military historian who happened to be at the palace researching ceremonial traditions, found himself transfixed by the scene. He began taking detailed notes, recognizing that he was observing something unprecedented. Never in his 20 years of studying military customs had he seen such a spontaneous display of international military courtesy. The rain continued for 45 minutes before finally stopping, but its effects lingered. Both soldiers were thoroughly soaked, their uniforms clinging to their bodies. Marcus's white gloves had taken on a grayish hue from the moisture, and James's normally immaculate appearance showed clear signs of the weather's impact, yet neither man acknowledged their discomfort. Marcus drew strength from memories of his fallen comrades, thinking of the friends he had lost in Afghanistan who would never again stand at attention for anything. James focused on the long tradition of his regiment, the centuries of guards who had stood their posts regardless of conditions. Captain Hayes approached Marcus during a brief moment when the crowd had thinned. Speaking quietly but firmly, he said, "Sir, you are not required to maintain this position. My guard is on duty, but you are under no obligation to continue." Marcus turned his head slightly, just enough to make eye contact with the British officer. "With respect, Captain, I understand my obligations. I choose to be here." The simple dignity of his response impressed Hayes immensely. Here was a soldier who understood the deeper meaning of military service, who recognized that some duties went beyond official orders and regulations. As word of the standoff spread, it reached the attention of Colonel Patricia Williams, the senior American military attaché at the U.S. Embassy. She arrived at the palace in civilian clothes, having been alerted by a colleague who had seen social media posts about the incident. Colonel Williams observed the scene carefully before approaching Captain Hayes. The two officers spoke briefly, sharing their professional assessments of what was happening. Both recognized that they were witnessing something special, a moment that transcended normal military protocol. "How long do you think they'll continue?" Colonel Williams asked. "Hard to say," Hayes replied. "Wellington is scheduled for another 2 hours, but he's capable of much more. Your Marine appears to be cut from similar cloth." The crowd had evolved throughout the afternoon. Early gawkers and casual tourists had been replaced by more serious observers. Military veterans, active service members from various nations, and people who simply appreciated displays of discipline and honor had gathered to witness the continuing standoff. Among them was Sergeant First Class Robert Jackson, a British Army veteran who had served in Iraq. He stood with tears in his eyes, remembering his own service and the bonds he had formed with American soldiers during joint operations. "This is what it means to serve," he told anyone who would listen. The physical toll was becoming more apparent as the third hour progressed. Marcus's legs ached from standing motionless on the hard stone surface, but he had learned to distribute his weight and control his breathing in ways that minimized fatigue. His training at Marine Corps boot camp in Paris Island had prepared him for exactly this kind of endurance test. James was equally experienced in managing physical discomfort. Royal Guard training included hours of stationary drill designed to build the exact stamina required for extended ceremonial duties. He had once stood for 4 hours during a state function, maintaining perfect posture while dignitaries from around the world passed by. The afternoon shadows grew longer as London's typical unpredictable weather brought another change. The clouds parted, and bright sunlight suddenly illuminated the courtyard. The contrast was striking. 2 soaked soldiers standing in golden afternoon light, neither willing to yield in their demonstration of mutual respect. Social media had taken notice of the event in a significant way. Videos and photographs were being shared across platforms with captions like "Military respect transcends borders" and "When soldiers honor soldiers." News outlets began picking up the story, though most reporters struggled to understand exactly what was happening and why. BBC correspondent Sarah Mitchell arrived at the scene and attempted to interview spectators. "It's not about winning or losing," explained Dr. Hassan when asked for his expert opinion. "Both men are demonstrating the highest ideals of military service. They're honoring not just each other, but everything their uniforms represent." The palace staff had adapted to the unusual situation with typical British efficiency. Barriers had been discreetly positioned to keep spectators at a respectful distance while allowing clear viewing of both soldiers. Security personnel maintained order without interfering with the proceedings. Inside the palace, word had reached the highest levels of staff. The private secretary to the Queen was briefed on the situation and made the decision to allow events to continue naturally. The respect being shown was clearly genuine, and interfering would serve no positive purpose. As the 4th hour approached, both soldiers showed signs of fatigue despite their training. Marcus's shoulders had begun to ache from maintaining his position, and small tremors occasionally ran through his leg muscles, but his resolve remained unshaken. He thought of his drill instructors, who had taught him that the mind could overcome any physical limitation. James felt the familiar burning sensation in his lower back that came from extended periods of standing at attention. His mouth was dry, and he could feel dehydration beginning to set in. Yet his training held firm. He had been taught that a royal guard was more than just a soldier. He was a symbol of unwavering British determination. The crowd had noticed the physical stress both men were experiencing, and a hushed tension settled over the observers. Some spectators began to worry about the health implications of such an extended display, but the military personnel present understood that both soldiers were still well within their capabilities. Colonel Williams found herself in an unusual position. As the senior American officer present, she had the authority to order Marcus to stand down, but doing so would undermine the very dedication he was demonstrating. After consultation with Captain Hayes, both officers agreed to monitor the situation closely while allowing it to continue. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting longer shadows across the courtyard, the silent showdown had become something larger than either participant had originally intended. It had evolved into a symbol of international military brotherhood, a demonstration that honor and respect knew no national boundaries. The 4th hour marked a turning point that no one could have predicted. News of the silent showdown had spread far beyond the palace gates, reaching military communities across both nations and around the world. What had begun as a spontaneous gesture of respect between 2 soldiers had captured global attention. General Sir Nicholas Carter, former Chief of the Defense Staff, received word of the incident while attending a conference in central London. Intrigued by reports of an American Marine's unprecedented display of respect for a British guard, he made the decision to visit the palace personally. His arrival sent ripples through the gathered crowd and palace staff alike. Meanwhile, at the Pentagon, Admiral James Reynolds was being briefed on the situation by his staff. The images and videos circulating online had reached the highest levels of American military leadership. "Sir," his aide reported, "the Marine is Marcus Thompson, currently attached to our London embassy. His service record is exemplary. 3 combat tours, multiple commendations for valor." Admiral Reynolds studied the photographs on his tablet, seeing something in the young Marine's bearing that reminded him of his own early service. "Keep me informed," he instructed. "If this man is representing our values this publicly, I want to ensure he receives appropriate recognition." Back at the palace, the physical challenge was becoming extreme for both soldiers. Marcus felt waves of dizziness wash over him as dehydration began to take its toll. His dress uniform, still damp from the earlier rain, clung uncomfortably to his skin. Every muscle in his body screamed for relief, but his mind remained focused on the duty he had chosen for himself. James was experiencing similar struggles. 5 hours of motionless standing had pushed him to the limits of even his extensive training. His vision occasionally blurred, and he could feel his body's desperate need for water and rest, yet something deeper than physical endurance kept him anchored to his post. Dr. Sarah Whitman, a physician who had been among the spectators for the past 2 hours, approached the supervising officers with growing concern. "Gentlemen," she said quietly to Captain Hayes and Colonel Williams, "both men are showing signs of severe dehydration. While I admire their dedication, their health is becoming a serious concern." The officers exchanged worried glances. They were caught between respecting the profound display they were witnessing and their responsibility for the welfare of the soldiers under their watch. The decision of when to intervene was becoming increasingly difficult. Among the crowd, the atmosphere had shifted from curiosity to something approaching reverence. Conversations were conducted in whispers, and many spectators found themselves deeply moved by what they were witnessing. Children who had been restless earlier now stood quietly beside their parents, somehow sensing the significance of the moment. Father Michael O'Brien, a military chaplain visiting London, had been present for the past 3 hours. He later described the experience. "I've served alongside soldiers in some of the most challenging situations imaginable, but I've never witnessed such a pure demonstration of military virtue. Both men had transcended their individual selves to represent something greater." The international implications were becoming apparent as military attachés from various embassies arrived to observe the proceedings. The French military attaché, Colonel Marie Dubois, commented to her colleagues, "This is what we speak of when we discuss military honor. These 2 young men have reminded us all why we serve." Inside the palace, arrangements were being made for an unprecedented situation. The Queen's private secretary had been in consultation with senior staff and had made the decision that Her Majesty should be informed of the remarkable display taking place in her courtyard. The recommendation was made that, should the situation continue much longer, a formal acknowledgement might be appropriate. As the 5th hour passed, both soldiers had entered a state that could only be described as transcendent. Marcus's mind had moved beyond physical discomfort to a place of pure determination. He thought of every Marine who had ever stood guard, every sentinel who had maintained their post against all odds. He was no longer just Marcus Thompson from Ohio. He was the embodiment of every value the Marine Corps had instilled in him. James had reached a similar state of mental clarity. The physical pain had become background noise to a deeper sense of purpose. In his mind, he carried the honor of every guardsman who had ever worn the red tunic, every soldier who had dedicated their life to service of the crown. His individual identity had merged with something much larger and more enduring. The crowd had grown to over 200 people, creating a management challenge for palace security. Barriers had been extended, and additional personnel had been called in to maintain order. Yet despite the size of the gathering, an almost church-like quiet prevailed. Among the newer arrivals was Sir James Wright, a decorated veteran of the Falklands War who now served on the board of several military charities. He positioned himself near the front of the crowd and began explaining to younger spectators the significance of what they were witnessing. "Military service," he said softly, "is ultimately about sacrifice, the willingness to put duty before personal comfort. These two men are demonstrating the highest ideals of that service, not for their own glory, but out of respect for each other and for the institutions they represent." General Sir Nicholas Carter arrived as the 6th hour began, accompanied by his aide and a small security detail. His presence immediately elevated the official significance of the event. After observing for several minutes, he approached Captain Hayes for a briefing on the situation. "How are they holding up?" "Captain," the general inquired. "Remarkably well, sir, though both are clearly at their physical limits. Neither has requested relief, and both appear determined to continue." The general studied both soldiers with an experienced eye. He had commanded men in combat and understood the mental fortitude required for such a display. "This is exceptional," he murmured. "Truly exceptional." Word of the general's presence spread quickly through the crowd, adding another layer of gravity to the proceedings. Military personnel in the crowd stood straighter, recognizing that they were witnessing something that had captured the attention of the highest levels of their profession. Colonel Williams received a secure phone call from the Pentagon, informing her that Admiral Reynolds was considering flying to London personally to witness the conclusion of the standoff. The implications were staggering. This spontaneous display of respect had reached the very top of both nations' military hierarchies. As evening approached, the palace staff faced an unprecedented logistical challenge. Normal closing procedures would have to be modified to accommodate the ongoing situation. Floodlights were discreetly positioned to ensure adequate illumination as darkness fell. The medical monitoring had intensified as well. Dr. Whitman, now working with a military medical officer who had arrived with General Carter, was keeping close watch on both soldiers for signs of serious distress. Both men showed symptoms of advanced fatigue and dehydration, but neither exhibited anything immediately life-threatening. Marcus could feel his heartbeat echoing in his ears, and his vision had narrowed to tunnel-like focus. Yet his mind remained crystal clear. He was no longer standing for himself or even for the respect he felt for the British Guard facing him. He was standing for every ideal that had shaped him as a Marine, for every brother in arms who had made the ultimate sacrifice. James felt as though he was floating somehow, his body maintained by willpower alone. The crowd, the palace, even his own discomfort had faded into background awareness. In his consciousness remained only duty, honor, and an unshakable commitment to proving worthy of the uniform he wore. The international media had begun arriving in force. BBC News, CNN, Sky News, and correspondents from dozens of other outlets were setting up equipment and interviewing spectators. The story was becoming global news, though many reporters struggled to convey the profound simplicity of what was actually happening. As the sun set over London, casting the ancient stones of Buckingham Palace in golden light, two soldiers continued their silent vigil. Neither knowing exactly when or how it would end, both utterly determined to honor the commitment they had made to each other and to the principles that defined their lives. The evening hours brought an almost mystical quality to the scene. Floodlights had been activated to illuminate the courtyard, creating dramatic shadows and highlighting every detail of the two soldiers' uniforms. The contrast was striking. Marcus in his dark blue marine dress uniform, and James in his traditional red tunic and black bearskin hat, both standing like statues against the backdrop of one of the world's most famous palaces. Admiral James Reynolds had made the decision to fly from Washington to London, arriving at Heathrow Airport as the 7th hour of the standoff began. His presence would mark the highest level of American military attention ever focused on such an event. The British government had been notified of his arrival, and arrangements were being made for him to visit the palace. Inside Buckingham Palace, an extraordinary meeting was taking place. Her Majesty the Queen had been fully briefed on the situation and had made a remarkable decision. She would personally acknowledge the display of respect taking place in her courtyard, breaking centuries of royal protocol. The private secretary was tasked with making appropriate arrangements for what would become a historic moment. The crowd had evolved throughout the evening into something resembling a vigil. People were sharing blankets, bringing hot tea for fellow spectators, and maintaining the respectful quiet that had characterized the event from its beginning. Children had been taken home to bed, replaced by adults who understood they were witnessing something extraordinary. Among the spectators was retired Master Sergeant Patricia Coleman, who had served with distinction in the U.S. Air Force for 30 years. She had been present for 6 hours, unable to leave despite her initial plan for a brief tourist visit. "I've seen a lot of military ceremonies in my time," she told a BBC reporter, "but nothing like this. This is pure honor, with no politics, no agenda. Just two soldiers respecting each other and everything their service represents." Dr. Hassan, the military historian, had been taking detailed notes and photographs throughout the event. His academic mind was already processing the implications of what he was documenting. "This will be studied in military academies for generations," he explained to colleagues via phone. "It's a perfect example of how military values transcend national boundaries." As the 8th hour began, both soldiers were operating purely on willpower and training. Marcus had entered a state that psychologists call flow, a condition where the body operates beyond normal limitations through pure mental focus. His Marine Corps training had prepared him for exactly this kind of extreme situation, though he had never imagined applying it in such circumstances. James was drawing on reserves of strength he didn't know he possessed. Royal Guard training emphasized mental toughness above all else, and he was discovering just how effective that preparation had been. His body was screaming for rest, but his mind remained locked on his duty with laser-like intensity. General Sir Nicholas Carter had been in communication with the highest levels of the British government throughout the evening. The Prime Minister had been briefed on the situation and had expressed both amazement and pride at the international attention being focused on British military traditions. The decision had been made to allow events to continue to their natural conclusion, whatever that might be. The medical team monitoring both soldiers was impressed by their physical resilience. Dr. Whitman, working alongside military medical officers from both nations, reported that while both men were severely fatigued and dehydrated, they showed no signs of imminent collapse. "Their training has clearly prepared them for extreme endurance situations," she explained to the supervising officers. Admiral Reynolds arrived at the palace at 9:30 p.m. local time, exactly 8.5 hours after the standoff had begun. His presence immediately elevated the significance of the event to the highest levels of military protocol. He was briefed by Colonel Williams and introduced to General Carter, beginning what would become an unprecedented display of international military cooperation. The two senior officers stood side by side, watching their respective soldiers maintain their vigil. "Admiral," General Carter said quietly, "your Marine is a credit to your service. I've never seen such a display from a foreign serviceman." "And your Guard is equally impressive, General," Reynolds replied. "This is what our alliance is truly about, mutual respect and shared values." As news of the Admiral's presence spread through the crowd, the atmosphere became even more charged with significance. Military personnel in the gathering straightened their posture and maintained even greater silence, recognizing that they were now witnessing an event of genuine historical importance. The turning point came as the 9th hour began. A palace equerry approached Admiral Reynolds and General Carter with an unprecedented message. Her Majesty the Queen wished to acknowledge the extraordinary display taking place in her courtyard and would make a brief appearance to honor both soldiers. The announcement sent shockwaves through the palace staff and military personnel present. Never in modern history had the monarch personally acknowledged such a spontaneous military display. The implications were staggering. This simple gesture of respect between two soldiers had captured the attention of the highest levels of both governments. Preparations began immediately for the Queen's appearance. Security protocols were reviewed and implemented, while maintaining the integrity of the ongoing vigil. Both Marcus and James remained unaware of the historic moment that was about to unfold around them. At exactly 10 p.m., Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II emerged from the palace, accompanied by a minimal retinue. She was dressed simply but elegantly, her presence immediately recognizable to the crowd despite the evening light. The assembled spectators fell into complete silence, many removing their hats in respect. The Queen approached to within 10 feet of both soldiers, her experienced eye taking in every detail of their bearing and condition. She had reviewed countless military ceremonies throughout her reign, but she had never seen such a pure display of military virtue. Speaking quietly to Admiral Reynolds and General Carter, she said, "These young men honor not just their own services, but the finest traditions of military service itself." Marcus became aware of the sudden change in atmosphere around him, sensing movement and increased tension in the crowd. His peripheral vision caught glimpses of additional security personnel and official-looking figures, but his training kept him focused straight ahead. He had no idea that he was now standing at attention before the British sovereign. James, bound by his oath to the crown, was acutely aware of his monarch's presence, but remained locked in his duty posture. Every fiber of his being wanted to acknowledge his queen, but his commitment to the vigil superseded even that fundamental instinct. The internal conflict was enormous, yet his training held firm. The Queen observed both soldiers for several minutes, noting their obvious exhaustion, but also their unwavering dedication. She had served during World War II and understood something about sacrifice and duty. What she saw in these two young men reminded her of the finest examples of military service from her long reign. Speaking to her private secretary, the Queen made another unprecedented decision. She would personally end the vigil, relieving both soldiers of their self-imposed duty with the highest possible honor. The message was conveyed to Admiral Reynolds and General Carter, who were stunned by the magnitude of the gesture. The Queen stepped forward, positioning herself where both soldiers could see her clearly. In a voice that carried the authority of 7 decades on the throne, she spoke. "Gentlemen, your display of honor and mutual respect has been witnessed and appreciated at the highest levels of both our nations. You have served with distinction and may now stand at ease." The effect was immediate and profound. Marcus, recognizing the voice of ultimate authority despite not initially knowing who was speaking, felt an enormous wave of relief wash over his body. 9 hours of physical and mental strain suddenly caught up with him, and he swayed slightly before regaining his balance. James, hearing his sovereign's voice, felt tears begin to form in his eyes for the first time since childhood. The combination of physical exhaustion and the unprecedented honor being shown overwhelmed his usual stoic demeanor. He had been personally acknowledged by his queen for a duty that went beyond any regulation or order. Both soldiers, moving as if in slow motion, relaxed their rigid postures. The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause that continued for several minutes, rolling across the courtyard like thunder. People were crying, laughing, and embracing each other, caught up in the emotional release of witnessing something truly extraordinary. Admiral Reynolds and General Carter stepped forward simultaneously, each approaching their respective soldier. The formal military protocols were observed, but with an underlying emotion that spoke to the significance of what had just occurred. "Well done, Marine," Admiral Reynolds said to Marcus, his voice thick with pride. "You've honored your corps and your country." General Carter's words to James were equally meaningful. "Outstanding, guardsman. You've upheld the finest traditions of your regiment." The Queen remained present as both soldiers were attended to by medical personnel and given water and basic care. She spoke briefly with each man, thanking them personally for their service and their display of international military courtesy. As the crowd began to disperse and the immediate intensity of the moment subsided, the full implications of what had occurred began to sink in. Two soldiers, through a simple gesture of mutual respect, had created an international incident of the most positive kind. They had demonstrated that military values of honor, duty, and respect transcended all political and national boundaries. In the days that followed, both Marcus and James would receive commendations from the highest levels of their respective governments. The story would be told and retold in military academies around the world, becoming a defining example of military professionalism and international cooperation. But in that moment, as floodlights illuminated the ancient stones of Buckingham Palace and two exhausted soldiers finally allowed themselves to rest, the simple truth remained. Honor recognizes honor, regardless of the uniform it wears or the flag it serves.